Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I am here today to give you my definitive review of the Canon RF 24-70mm F2.8L IS USM lens. Now this is the definitive review, and so we'll be covering everything in detail. If you prefer the quicker, more to the point episode, I recommend that you take a look at the standard review, which you can access here. Today, however, we're going to be breaking things down in detail and looking at this standard zoom that covers from wide angle at 24 millimeters to 70 millimeters, kind of a short telephoto range, and in many ways becomes one of the indispensable tools for those of you that shoot weddings or events, or maybe just want, maybe even portraiture, or just want kind of a general high-purpose zoom to use for a variety of photos. And if that's what you're looking for, then this is a great fit. Now, it is designed for Canon's mirrorless systems, and so I've actually performed this review on the EOS R5, which I'm filming on at the moment, and I did my standard test on that because of the higher resolution, a little bit more demanding. But I also used it extensively kind of as the primary lens during my review of the new EOS R6 as well. And so I got a lot of photos with both cameras and was really pleased with performance along the way. And we'll break down why that is as we jump into this review. Today's episode is brought to you by Ridge, the wallet redefined. Give your aching rear a break and ditch that bulky old wallet full of stuff you don't need and move to a sleek aluminum, titanium, carbon fiber, or even their new 18-karat gold Ridge wallet. It takes up little more room than a credit card, has RFID blocking technology to protect your valuable information, and comes with a lifetime warranty. Visit ridge.com/Dustin and use code Dustin to get 10% off your order, along with free shipping worldwide. We'll start by taking a look at the build and handling of this lens and give you an idea of what you're getting in terms of grade and in terms of how the lens performs. Let's jump in and let's take a look. So the first thing that stands out, has been the case with basically most of the RF lenses, is that it actually seems quite large. Early on we saw with the 24-105 that it was actually a little bit smaller than the alternative EF lens, and so we thought that might be a trend, but in many cases we're getting larger lenses than what we saw actually on EF mount. That's true here, though physically it's not tremendously larger. To give you an idea, the EF lens was identical in diameter, 88.5 millimeters, but it was shorter. It was 113 millimeters, whereas this lens is 125.7 millimeters. And on top of that, this lens is heavier at 900 grams, or right under 2 pounds. So that makes it the heaviest of any of kind of the alternate lenses out there, including the Sony GM lens, which is the next heaviest at 886 grams. But the EF mount lens L Mark II and then the Nikkor Z 24-70 millimeter, both of those lenses weigh 805 grams, so nearly 100 grams lighter than this lens. And then of course, if you're looking at a lens like the Tamron 28-75, you can see how diminutive it is. This is for Sony FE, obviously, but you can see just how much smaller a lens it is. And so, I've kind of gotten accustomed to this kind of philosophy, and so as a byproduct, this lens does feel a little bit on the large side to me. However, what we have got is a really well-constructed lens. And so Canon makes clear that in terms of the weather sealing, we have got a gasket here. We have got seals internally near all of the... Anyone else noticed that these new Canon caps are kind of a pain? Anyway, we've got seals at all of the various rings, near the switches, any of the transition zones in there. On top of that, they have designed this to be vibration proof. And what that means is it's just internally engineered to where it can take knocks and not become decentered. And so, in other words, it's built for professional grade use. In this case, Canon puts a flooring coating on both the front and rear elements that make them, resistant to fingerprints, but also easier to clean. And that's all kind of part of the weather sealing suite. We also have a near matte finish, just very, very lightly flocked And the byproduct of this is that I think that this is going to be a finish that is very resistant to either marking, or obviously it doesn't take fingerprints at all. You pull this Tamron back up here for a moment, and you can just see some, inconsistent places where oils off my hands, my fingers have just, kind of made the finish inconsistent, but that's not going to be the case here. This lens is going to look pretty much the same whether you've just taken it out of the box or you've just gotten through using it for, a few years. And so, I think a lot of durability there. We've got 3 different rings. You can see the first is the one that has the bevel in it, and I like that Canon has done this quite often. What it gives you is a very strong sense of what ring you're using in a tactile sense. And so it's easy to feel and to say, okay, that's the zoom ring, it's got the bevel in the middle. The manual focus ring has, no bevel to it, and then the control ring has this kind of diamond pattern finish that is a completely different feel by, just the tactile response. And so I think that they've done a good job of differentiating all 3 rings, even though 3 rings is a lot to have on a lens, obviously. In this case, I think there's enough room because of it being a larger lens, and so the zoom action is very nice and smooth, no inconsistencies, it moves consistently. You can see I measured it is right at around 4 centimeters of extension, and so it will extend out a little ways. The manual focus ring, again, it's focused by wire, so no hard stops or anything like that. Damping is pretty consistent, and focus is not too bad. Very likely you won't often manual focus, but it's not a bad experience. And then of course the control ring does have like detents in it. It's designed that way. You can pay to have it declicked if you wanted to use it, like for a declicked aperture, for example, but that is a paid service that Canon does provide. Lens hood is pretty straightforward. It does have a little lock on it, but it's just plastics and with some ribbing inside. Nothing exceptional there. Up front we have an 82mm front filter thread, which was the same on the EF lens, and inside we have 9 rounded aperture blades. As you can see from this sequence, the aperture stays quite circular. Geometry is actually quite good from the lens. Now, an interesting thing is when it comes to the minimum focus distance. They've kind of taken a page out of Tamron's book, and that you've got varying minimum focus distances depending on the focal length. So you can focus down quite a bit closer at 24 millimeters, as little as 21 centimeters. And so remember, that's 21 centimeters less the length of the lens itself, and so that is nearly 13 centimeters. Plus you can probably take another couple of centimeters or close to it to get to where the actual sensor lies. And so I would say that's roughly 15 centimeters. It means you only have about 6 to work with. So you have to pretty much take off the lens hood to get up on your subject at that point. And then at 70 millimeters, you can't get as close. I think it's around 38 centimeters of a minimum focus distance. But interestingly, according to Canon, the maximum magnification figure of 0.30 times is not found at either 24 or 70 millimeters, but actually found at 32 millimeters, which is a really odd place for that. So not as useful as what the figure itself suggests. And I think at 70 millimeters and that 38 centimeter minimum focus, you're going to get a more similar, I think maybe just slightly over what the EF lens was. I would say around 0.22 or 0.23 times magnification, which is useful. Not as useful as 0.30, but I just don't know with that, being so close to your subject and that kind of weird place to find that, how often you'll actually achieve that high of magnification. There are total of 3 different switches that are here. And so one is AF, MF, one is just an on and off for the stabilizer itself, and we'll talk more about stabilizer in a moment. But there is also then a locking mechanism. This lock will not lock at any place but 24 millimeters. I have found that the lens itself is really nicely damped, and so I actually haven't actually run into a situation where I've had to lock it, and so of course your mileage may vary depending on what you're doing with the lens itself. Overall, however, outside of it being large and heavy, this is a beautifully made lens, and functionally it works just the way that I'd want it to. It feels like and looks like a Canon L series lens, just like it should. So my biggest takeaways from that is that it's not a light lens. It's actually a bit heavier than any of the previous 24 to 70 millimeter lenses that I've looked at before. And so, it is on the heavy side. However, this is a really nicely made lens. And when I look at some of the other mirrorless options that I'm comparing it to, I do note that this is the only one of the main alternatives I looked at that actually has a built-in image stabilizer. And so the fact that it weighs in at anywhere from, around 85 grams to as little as around less than 20 grams when you're comparing to the Sony GM lens, and you've got an image stabilizer in there, tells me that the lens is probably not overweight, but it certainly isn't a small or light lens. And so if you're looking for small and light, you may need to look elsewhere. But it's a really great degree of build, and Canon has really packed in a lot of features to really help this lens to withstand the rigors of everyday professional grade use. And I can say this, that I have some L series lenses in my kit that I've had for over 10 years and use them as a professional, and they still look and handle very much like new. And so I think that Canon kind of knows its business when it comes to building these professional grade lenses, and so I feel confident about that. Also positive is the image stabilization. Now, when you're talking about combining this lens with one of the newer bodies like the R5 or R6, you're getting a combined effect. So if you're using an older EOS R or RP body, you're going to get about 5 stops of image stabilization from the lens itself. Obviously no stabilization in the camera body. If you're using the newer R5 or R6, or if you're watching this at a future date, some camera yet unreleased that has image stabilization, Canon has designed it to where there's constant communication, to where the two systems are supposed to complement one another. So Canon claims that you can get up to 8 stops of stabilization with this lens on an R5 or an R6. That's a pretty lofty claim, and one that I'm not entirely sure can be supported in the real world, at least with me, with my hands. I can get, I think, somewhere close to 6 stops, which I think is very, very impressive. However, I've never been capable of hand-holding what would need to be, at 70 millimeters, you would need to be able to hand-hold around a 3-second, about 3.2 second exposure to achieve 8 stops, and that just doesn't happen for me. I have nailed shots down to close to 1 second, but I find that you just get even just the slap of the shutter mechanism is enough vibration that it's hard to handhold a shot like that. But where I do find the stabilization to be very, very effective is if I am hand holding, say, a video shot where I just want to hold it in a stable fashion. And whereas that kind of footage just doesn't work without image stabilization, there's just too much little moving around, I find that I can get really steady results from that. Not bad if I'm doing small pans or things like that. But for movement, as you can see here, I find movement still a little bit unnatural. Certainly nothing compared to what it looked like when I threw, the combination of the R6 and the 24-70 onto a gimbal, and of course got much smoother kind of results there. So I think that, as always, you have to use image stabilization systems to their strengths and understand their limitations. Also, as always, remember the fact that no amount of image stabilization, no matter how effective, is going to stop movement of your subject. And so you can really only handhold, slow shutter speeds if you're working with a static or a constant subject that doesn't move. If you're filming anything that moves or, photographing anything that moves, it's better to keep that shutter speed up to stop action, obviously. And so at the same time, however, I don't want this to appear negative because it's very, very positive. This is a great image stabilization system. It's smooth, it's quiet, it gets the job done. In a similar fashion is the autofocus. This uses Canon's Nano USM technology, which I've been really pleased with in basically every application that I have tested. It tends to be very fast, which is the case here. Autofocus is very fast, and I consider what I was accustomed to with, say, in a previous generation using, say, a Tamron 24 to 70 millimeter. Now the G2 of that lens did speed up autofocus, but never quite to the level that we see here, where autofocus in most situations is fairly instantaneous. And I will add to that, the amazing sensitivity of the sensors on the R6 or the R5 means that you can also, and for that matter, even the EOS R, you can focus down in very, very dim conditions and still get consistently focused results without a massive amount of slowdown. Obviously, you're not going to focus as quickly, but I'm pretty impressed with autofocus there. So that tells me that this is going to be it's not wedding season. I haven't shot any weddings with it. I will say, however, though, that this is a lens and a combination on one of these new mirrorless bodies that I think would work great for like a dimly lit wedding, church kind of venue where, you don't have as much light to work with, but it's just really, really confident. And so I give high marks for that. As I've already mentioned, focus speed is excellent. Also, focus sound is very good. You're basically not going to hear anything when you're just photographing, and we'll take a look at video pulls here to see the effect there. So as you can hear, just the faintest amount of clicking, and frankly, it's only in that kind of absolutely quiet environment that I heard it at all. In other clips, I shot a number of clips with it where there is some kind of environmental noise, even if it's just the sound of my feet moving if I'm on a gimbal. I did not hear any focus noise at all. And of course, it's rare in those kind of settings where you're making a big focus pull anyway. And so it was a non-issue for real world work. And so I was very impressed with that. I was also happy with, IAF, which has been it's so nicely realized with, Canon's most recent technology. And so, like it's doing right now, it's just, I can see because I have the articulating screen facing towards me on the R5, and I can see that as I kind of move around just naturally, that little box is staying constantly on my eye. And it's true whether you're shooting video or stills, it just makes it really quite effortless, particularly with a human or animal subject. It just tracks the eye so well. And so anyway, nothing to be concerned about on that front. So let's talk about image quality. We're going to jump in and take a look at image quality and see how things hold up here. Let's take a look. So the first thing that we'll take a look at is our distortion and vignette at 24 millimeters. And so pretty typical flaws here. You can definitely see some pronounced barrel distortion that is there. It does happen in a bit of a mustache pattern, as you can see, so it doesn't correct super well manually. As we can see, however, the actual correction profile does a pretty good job of correcting it if you're using an automatic profile. A little tougher is the vignette pattern. Vignette is, it's very pronounced, but just in the extreme corners. And so once again, it's not a linear pattern in that it's just not like a slow kind of creep towards a center that's fairly even. It's very concentrated in the corners, which has tended to be a little bit of a Canon flaw recently. And what that means is that you kind of are left with a catch-22. As you can see, the standard profile is elected to try to get as even as possible throughout most of the frame, except for the extreme corners, which remain fairly dark, as you can see. And so it's, kind of trying to find that balance. But because it's so concentrated in the corners, what that means is that if you were to completely correct the corners, which have over 3.5 stops, between 3.5 and 4 stops of darkness, it would overcorrect the rest of the image. And so you have to kind of find a happy medium. And so obviously that's not great. Now, whether or not this will be a factor really depends on your shooting environment. And so this time of year, I am shooting in wintry conditions, which means snow. Snow is particularly punishing a vignette because you can't just hide the darkness in the shadows that might exist in the foreground. They are going to impact the image, as you can see pretty obviously here or over on this side. And so typically you do have to, correct for it. At 70 millimeters, there is a mild amount of pincushion distortion. More linear, not a big deal. You can see it corrects perfectly. Vignette is less heavy, more like around 2.5 stops in the corners. However, it is a similar pattern in that it's just particularly dark in the extreme corners, not kind of a uniform or linear pattern. At the same time, I do find that the standard correction profile does a slightly better job here, probably because it's less extreme, and so you get a more even end result. So here's a look at the test chart at 24 millimeters. Now, just so you know, kind of my standard protocol, while I've done some tests on the R6, like general purpose shooting, I do all of these formal tests on the R5. So that's a 45 megapixel resolution. I examine the test chart results at a 200% magnification. That makes it easy for you to see the end results, and it also gives me a consistency of how I assess my lenses across the board. So taking a look in the center of the frame, we've got f2.8 and then we have f4. And so you can see that we've got a good amount of resolution. The acuity could be a little bit higher due to just increasing contrast a little bit. We can see at f4 there is progress there, but a sharp result in the middle. A very sharp result mid-frame. It actually looks really, really fantastic mid-frame. Similar type result as we see here at f4. Not a big difference between the two. And we can see that the sharpness profile does extend right down towards the corners. Contrast improves at f4, but right off towards the edge of the frame, we've got usable resolution there, and so strong end result. So contributing to this at f2.8, we can see that if I look at kind of a high contrast area. So first of all, this looks really, really great for being a high contrast situation and wide open f2.8. But you can see in the really bright transition zones where you've got the dark branches and then the white and the transition to the sky. There's no bleeding over of any kind of aberrations there, and so you have really crisp lines. Also, you can see that there is just a tiny bit of evidence of any kind of lateral chromatic aberration, so not a major factor there either, as you can see on either side. Also in this image where you've got a lot of shiny reflective surfaces, we can see that we have got really good, again, this is f2.8, 24 millimeters. We've got really good handling of these, kind of difficult contrast of light and shadow, and the detail in the image looks quite good here. This is actually at 28 millimeters, but it gives you an idea of looking at a real world kind of landscape scene, and we can see that there is good detail throughout the scene, good contrast. This is certainly a very sharp lens from wide open on. Stopping on down from f4 to f5.6 definitely improves our contrast, and so you can see we've got really great punch now in the corners with the lens stopped down to landscape apertures. So case in point at f5.6, even though everything is kind of misty and so that does take away contrast, you can see that the detail, and this is on the R5, so this is very high resolution, but you can see that the detail everywhere is really, really nice. And so, at landscape apertures, you're going to get a lot of punch out of the lens. Here's at f8. This is actually on the R6, so the resolution, as you can see, isn't as high as we zoom in towards the details, but you can see we do have resolution right out to the very edges of the frame. A little bit of lateral CA there. That's the one-click version that's very easy to correct for, but I haven't corrected aberrations, and so you can see the kind of raw image here. Minimum aperture is f22, and so you can see that there definitely is some impact from diffraction, and so you can just see a general softening, lack of contrast there, even compared to f2.8. In all of these textures, you can just see that everything just kind of loses that acuity and ability to render those fine details. So, as always, I recommend avoiding minimum aperture unless you absolutely need it. If we move on to 35 millimeters, a couple of things to observe. Center performance is better. You can see better contrast, and it's a little bit sharper acuity there. Stopping down to f4 just gives a little bit more punch in the contrast, but everything's looking really great. Moving to mid-frame looks fantastic. I mean, really, really great. Right towards the very edge of the frame, there's just as you get to that final little percentage, you can see that there is some loss of detail there. Stopping down to f4 improves that, and stopping on to f5.6, which is most likely where you're going to need corner performance, shows an even better result. And so I think for most real-world shots, you're still going to get great detail corner to corner if you're shooting at smaller apertures. There's no drop off at 50 millimeters. You can see that middle of the frame looks really fantastic, nice and sharp, and stop down to f4, just even more contrast. Mid-frame looks fantastic, very good once again. And down into the corner, you can see kind of that same trend that we saw at 35 millimeters, a little bit of a drop off, not quite as much off towards the very edge. Stopping down a bit starts to improve things.
And by the time you get to f5.6 or smaller, you can see that we have got that sharpness right off towards the corners of the frame with a peak around f5.6, f8. This real-world shot at 50 millimeters, wide open, shows really nice punch here, in contrast where it matters. And you can see bokeh is a little bit busy because it's, the ratio doesn't really favor this kind of shot. But overall, however, I think you've got a nice bit of dimensionality there. And I think that the image itself, contrast everything, it looks good. Moving on to 70 millimeters, resolution still looks good. Contrast drops just a little bit at 70 millimeters. We'll observe why in just a moment. You can see it does improve some as you stop down to f4. Mid-frame still looks good, but not as exceptional in terms of that contrast and just really popping as we've seen before. Down into the corner, resolution looks good. Actually, the actual lines, the acuity of the lines is pretty decent. However, you can see that contrast is not quite as good. But at f4 it does improve a little bit. Now, part of the reason for that reduced contrast is if we get something with shiny surfaces on it, like this lens at close focus distance, you can see that there is more longitudinal chromatic aberrations here, both of the the purple, but in particular that kind of green-blue fringing that is there, which does reduce contrast a bit. I don't want to oversell that though, because here we have 70 millimeter f2.8, and you can see that actually our contrast in the center of the frame on our subject is really quite fantastic. And so there's great detail there. You can see the texture in on the sign, and the real world images actually look quite good. In certain high contrast situations, you will pick up on a little bit of that fringing, as you can see here as you start to go out of focus. Stopping on down from f4 to f5.6 does further improve contrast, and as you can see, we start to get looking quite excellent in the mid frame, and down into the corner we're also getting a good result. So this is a lens that is sharp across the zoom range. In some cases you need to stop down a little bit to get maximum performance, but at no place do I think it is anything but high performing in comparison to other standard zooms that I've seen. Now, we looked at the geometry before. I'm going to just pop you in and give you a closer look at those the bokeh circles. You can see some of that fringing that we have referred to. You can also see the fact that there's just some general busyness, not quite to the place of onion bokeh, but not far from it there. And so with bright lights, there is definitely some busyness that will impact the bokeh quality. But as I noted, the geometry is really good. It actually keeps quite a circular shape, even towards the edges of the frame. So the quality of real-world bokeh is really going to depend a lot on kind of your ratio of distance to the subject to the background. We've seen that in some cases earlier on, backgrounds looked a little bit more busy if the subject was further away. In this case, the subject being closer and, so detail's good on the subject. The background is blurred away quite nicely. We'll look at one more, and here you can see subject being even closer, and we have a really creamy looking background. So, as is per usual with a lens like this, the quality of the bokeh is really going to depend upon how you use the lens and what situations you put it in. Finally, a quick look at flare resistance, which I'm happy to report is actually really good. You can see there is a little bit of a ghosting pattern here at f2.8. And it's not really more pronounced at f11. What you can also see, however, is that contrast has held up really well in the image. And of course, if you look here, you can see from this video footage that while there is that kind of ghosting pattern that follows the axis of the sun rays, it's, I would say, fairly artistic and useful in various situations. And so I'm not at all displeased with it.
I'll have to say that I was actually far more impressed with this 24 to 70 millimeter than what I was with either the 15 to 35 millimeter, which I thought was good but not exceptional when it came to actual image sharpness, and likewise with the 70 to 200 RF f2.8, which I thought was very good, center and mid frame, a little bit weaker in the corners, but even in the places where it was strong. In real-world images, I just felt a little more consistently impressed with what I saw out of the 24 to 70. I feel like it is really delivering a strong performance, and very possibly the best that I've personally seen for a standard zoom like this. And so I think that Canon it already had an exceptional lens in the EF 24 to 70 Mark II, and I think that they've managed to improve at least mildly on that. And so the end product is just a really, great lens. And so while it is expensive at around $2,300 US, at least you don't feel like you're getting an underachieving optical performance if you're paying a premium price. And so to wrap things up, I would say that this is a lens that probably will be and should be a staple for many professional photographers that are adopting Canon's full-frame mirrorless system. It gives you that great combination of image stabilization, great autofocus, a great build, but then also a really strong optical performance that is only marred really by that heavy distortion at 24 millimeters. But fortunately, these days, it's not all that hard to correct that. And even the various aberrations that we saw, they didn't seem to be all that destructive in real-world use for the most part. And by and large, I was very happy with images that I got out of the camera. And so if you're looking for a professional grade standard zoom, there's not a lot of options, and fortunately this is a very good one. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also to the image gallery if you want to check out photos. There are buying links in the description, as well as linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter that comes out every Thursday, and of course if you haven't already, you need to subscribe right here on YouTube, as well as click that bell and so that you get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching today. Have a great day.